Today I want to talk to you about written corrective feedback, and sometimes people call this written error correction, but in fact the terminology has changed a little bit now, and now we call it written corrective feedback because we realize that a lot of the feedback that we give our students, it's not all targeted to errors, and sometimes we give students feedback on their content and their organization. So instead of calling it written error feedback, now the term has changed and is now called written corrective feedback. In this presentation, we're going to talk about three different types of error correction, or corrective feedback, I should say, and different types of errors and different types of, or different approaches to correction. And what I want to do initially is to develop a vocabulary that we can use to discuss the kinds of things that you may be doing or that you may observe other people doing when they're providing written corrective feedback in a second language. I'm going to show you three different types of corrections that teachers often make in their written corrective feedback. The first type of corrective feedback that we typically give is direct feedback. And you can see here on the side that there's a sentence that a student has written with some errors in it. And if you take a look at how the teacher has responded to those errors, you can see that the teacher has actually crossed out the error and has written the correct answer right next to that spot where the error was. And so the teacher is actually providing the answer to the student. And so you can see that this is what we call direct, or sometimes we call it explicit correction, where the teacher actually provides the correct answer to the students. And students often like this, and no wonder, because they are actually getting the answer for them. So if you're asking the student to rewrite, then what they need to rewrite is right there. So it's quite easy for the student to do that. It's also quite time-consuming for the teacher to do this, to have to cross out and provide the correct answer. So that can be, the direct correction is generally preferred by students, but can also be quite time-consuming for teachers. Now I'd like to show you a different kind of corrective feedback. This type of corrective feedback is called indirect correction. And you can see again on the side here that you have the same sentence with the same errors in it. And you can see that the teacher has actually, what the teacher has done here is they have identified the error for the student, but they have not corrected it. So this is why we call it indirect correction. The teacher is providing a clue as to the location of the error, so it helps the student identify which word or words may be a little problematic, but the teacher is not actually providing the correction. So what do you think? Often students prefer this a little bit less than they do direct correction because it makes them work a little bit harder. The teacher has still located the error. That's really important because we know that students really have a hard time finding the location of their errors. No surprise, because if they could locate their errors, they could probably correct them on their own. So it's important for the teacher to actually locate the error, but the teacher is stopping short of actually providing the answer, and so asking the student to do the cognitive work that is required to correct the error. So this is called indirect correction. Okay, and the last type of correction that I want to show you and talk to you about is called coded correction. And again, you can see here we're working with the same error, or the same sentence with the same errors in it that the student has provided. And you can see in this case the teacher has provided codes that indicate the type of error. So again, the teacher is locating the error with the insertion of the code and going a little bit further. It's a little bit more of a scaffolded approach than an indirect method, but not quite as scaffolded as a direct method. So it's sort of the in-between method of error correction. It locates the error, and the code then provides a little bit of support for students they can identify through the code what type of error they've made. So it helps them a little bit more. So you can think of the 3 different types of correction as different levels of scaffolding, with direct correction being the most scaffolded and indirect correction being the least scaffolded, and the coded correction being somewhere in the middle. The challenge with doing coded correction, of course, is that students have to know and understand the code. So if you're using a code like SVA, typically that's used for subject-verb agreement, but students have to know that, recognize the code, and understand that. And then they'll be able to respond appropriately to correct it. So again, if you're asking the student to rewrite, which typically we do, then the code can help them with that. Students really like this type of corrective feedback. It does make them work a little bit harder, and the challenge here is that they have to know the code. So if you're going to teach a class like this and provide this kind of corrective feedback, you have to explicitly teach the codes first. Alright, so you've just learned about 3 different types of correction: indirect, direct, and coded. And now what I want to talk to you about is different approaches to correction. And there's 2 vocabulary words I want to give you here. One is global correction and the other is selective correction. And so these are 2 different approaches. You can guess that the global correction means that the teacher provides correction for every error that there is. And typically students want this type of correction, and typically teachers don't necessarily want to provide it to their students. And so there's an interesting tension there between what the student wants and what the teacher wants. Teachers may object to giving global correction because it can be a lot of correction, particularly if the students are making lots of errors. And so it can take the teacher a lot of time, but also teachers think that that amount of feedback can be hugely overwhelming for a student, particularly if they're a lower level proficiency. And just think about how that would be, how you would respond to that with enormous amounts of error correction if your paper came back completely red or green or whatever color you choose to use with your corrective feedback. So that's sort of a bit of tension there between what the students and the teachers want. The other approach to correction is selective correction, and that's typically what teachers do provide, although again the students still would prefer to see all of their errors corrected. Selective correction is where the teacher decides which errors need to be corrected. Typically these are errors that have been taught in class, or perhaps they are errors that are so significant in nature that they really impede the comprehensibility of the text. And so the teachers will decide and use their judgment about which errors are the highest priority, or the ones that need to be most corrected in order to make the text better. And so they will select the errors. Students often think that they want to have every correction made. And so again, this is the challenge between what the teacher wants, thinks is best, and is able to provide, and what the students actually want. Alright, so now I want to talk to you about different types of errors then that students can make. And so the vocabulary that I want to discuss with you, there are 4 different vocabulary words that will help us talk about them. So students can make global errors or local errors. These are the first 2 terms I want to introduce. The global errors are errors that create huge problems for the reader. Essentially, we say that they impede the comprehensibility for the reader. What kind of errors are global errors? Oftentimes, global errors are verb tense errors. You can imagine if you read a sentence and you're not really clear whether the student is talking about something that's happened in the past, or that will happen in the future, or that is happening in the present. These kinds of errors are typically global errors. Sentence structure errors are another type of error that are often global errors. Sentence boundary errors, where you're not sure exactly where one sentence ends and finishes, and the content may flow together, and you're not sure exactly what the sentence is about. These types of errors are often considered global errors, and teachers typically address those quickly because they impede comprehensibility so much. Really, when you read them as a teacher, you can't understand what the student means, and so you need to address those right away. On the other hand, there is what we call local errors, and these are typically errors that students make in writing, but really it's not a big problem. They don't impede comprehensibility. What type of errors are local errors? These are very typically article errors. So you think if your student leaves out a the or puts an a instead of a the, uses the definite instead of the indefinite article or whatever, often we note the error, but it really doesn't change the meaning of that sentence for that particular student. And there are other types of errors. It could be, you know, plural nouns is another one. Often our students leave out s's off of plural nouns. And it could also be subject-verb agreement in the third person present tense singular, where they're missing that s on the verb. And although we note that that's an error, usually it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, and oftentimes people have quite significant native speakers or the people who are consuming those texts, reading or listening to those texts, have quite high tolerance of those type of errors, and so we call those local errors. And teachers will have to use their judgment as to whether that's an important error to correct right now for that student, or if it's the type of error that can be left for a little while because it doesn't change the meaning of the student's intent. Other types of errors include idiomatic or rule-bound errors, and those are a little bit opposites, so I'll just explain them a little bit. You can imagine, or I'm sure you're familiar with those idiomatic expressions that we use in English. We use them quite a lot. It could be prepositional phrases, anything like that. It could be an expression, something that we often use in English just because we say things that way. We get in the bus and in the car, but on the train, that kind of thing. These are very idiomatic expressions. And so when students make those errors, we call those idiomatic errors. And that could also extend to a kind of a collocation as well, where the student has just used the incorrect word to use in conjunction with another word. They selected the wrong verb, that kind of thing. Those would be idiomatic errors. And again, the teacher needs to decide whether or not to address those. The challenge with those errors is that if you want to address them and you address them in an indirect way, remember indirect correction is just where the teacher locates the error without providing the correction for it. That it's very difficult for students then to go to a grammar book, for example, and find the correct error. They may be able to go to a dictionary. Oftentimes our students aren't using dictionaries that much, or they use electronic dictionaries, which may be a little imperfect, particularly with idiomatic expressions, and they may not get the correct answer there. So oftentimes with idiomatic errors, teachers are encouraged, or it is suggested that teachers actually use more direct correction if the error is idiomatic. So you can see that we move towards a little bit more nuanced look at how teachers provide correction, not just all direct correction or all indirect correction or all coded correction for that matter, but depending on the type of error, the teacher may actually want to respond in a different way. So with idiomatic errors, the teacher may want to provide direct correction because it would be quite difficult for the student to find the correct answer to that. On the other hand, there are rule-bound errors, and these are just the opposite of idiomatic. These are the types of errors that students should clearly either know because they've learned it already, you've taught them already, or they should be easily findable, searchable in a grammar textbook or an online resource. The answer is quite clear. It's sort of a binary solution, either it's right or it's wrong. These are what we call rule-bound errors, and it is quite useful for teachers in this case to reduce their marking load by providing, or marking time I should say, by providing indirect correction in that sense, or even coded correction. You're not providing the correct answer to the student, but the student should be able to find it because it's a rule-bound error. So our challenge then as teachers is to decide how to respond to student errors. And you can see that it may not be as easy as you might think. One of the things you need to consider, just as I previously discussed, is the type of error. You may want to respond differently to different types of errors. So again, if it's a rule-bound error, you may just locate the error, provide indirect correction. If it's an idiomatic error, you may want to provide some direct correction to support those students. The other really important thing to think about is the proficiency level of your students. So if your students are at a fairly high level, you may actually be able to provide them with global correction, that is, correcting all the errors, perhaps because hopefully they're not making so many errors at a quite advanced level, it wouldn't overwhelm them with feedback. So that's something. And then again, as your students gain proficiency, you may want to move from a direct type of feedback to an indirect feedback, because they become better adept at identifying and correcting their own errors. Whereas if you have a lower level student, they're still going to need that support, so you may want to provide them with a little bit more direct correction. So you can see here how providing written corrective feedback then becomes a nuanced process, a process based on judgment, depending on the level of students, the type of error, and the context within which you work. So these are really important considerations when you're deciding how to respond to student written error. Your goal as a teacher then, when you're providing written error feedback, is to build students' awareness of the types of errors that they're making, so that they become aware of their most common errors and they develop strategies to address those. So by the time any writing course finishes, they should know whether they have problems with subject-verb agreement in the present tense, third person singular. That should be something that they're familiar with, and then they can choose to proofread for that particular error, or they may find other strategies to deal with those things. But that should be your goal as a teacher. Typically, written corrective feedback is not something that teachers enjoy doing. It's often the bane of our existence, and so I would encourage you to try and mix things up a little bit to see what works for your students. And I can give you some suggestions here. You can vary the way you provide written corrective feedback using different methods, so indirect or coded or direct, but you can also think about providing some oral feedback to students on a written text. It might leaven a little bit of the written feedback, the heaviness or the overwhelmingness of the correction. There are people that I know who provide only oral correction now to written texts, so you need a little bit of technology to do that, of course. So you need to, typically what they do is they read the text, and when there's an error, they'll say, oh, that's a mistake, that's a subject-verb agreement error, and you need to address that, and then they would continue reading. So depending on the length of the text, you may need to have a sound file of perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. And you need the technology, of course, to communicate that to the student. Typically, students are quite savvy now about managing sound files. So try out different things. Another thing that you can do is you can number the errors in a student's text as you go along, and then categorize them in a table. It's quite simple to make a table of your students' most common errors. And so if their first 2 errors happen to be article errors, you can list that in the article row in your table. And then that provides a kind of a profile for students to see, and they can see how many errors they're making and of which type. And this allows them to build awareness of their most common errors. So that's one possibility. The other thing is if you don't want to categorize them, you can still create the table for the students, number off the mistakes, and then ask the students to categorize the errors themselves. That's another challenge, another activity that you can do. And so those are interesting ways to kind of leaven your workload related to providing written corrective feedback. So it can be challenging for teachers. Often we have a lot of it to do, but do try and vary what you do to make your life interesting and to keep your students on their toes. So to summarize then, what we did today was, I hope what we did was build a vocabulary for you to discuss written corrective feedback. There are 3 different methods of providing corrective feedback: direct, indirect, and coded, that we talked about. There are different approaches to providing written corrective feedback: global and selective, where the teacher uses his or her judgment to provide that kind of feedback. And there are different types of errors: global errors, local errors, idiomatic and rule-bound errors. And you may want to vary your methods of correction based on the type of error. And don't ever forget the proficiency level of your students, because that will play quite a bit into your judgment of whether what type of correction they need. Good luck with your written corrective feedback.